This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
When a guard would stop and talk to you, you used to stand back and you would yell so people could hear what you were saying to that guard as they walked by or within the vicinity.
But he knew what a convict was going to do before they thought of it themselves. He just been around that long, and he was tough.
They'd find Sprocky in about every conceivable place you could imagine, which we would, of course, dump.
They'd wait until everybody was locked up, and he would open his door and run down to cell one and get a bugler can full of Sprocky and take it back to his cell.
She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and those cats would go to her.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a very spooky episode of Behind Gray Walls. My name is Anthony, and I'm talking here with Skye.
Hi, everyone. Happy Halloween. Spooky
Happy Halloween. Okay. So, this episode is all about the ghost stories that we've collected at the prison. Skye, do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts? I think that I do. I don't know if I'm I'm for sure no ghost hunter. But I think that they exist. I think it would make sense that people who were living on Earth for whatever reason don't want to leave or can't leave, and they stick around. Do you?
You know, I go back and forth because as a child, I had a few experiences myself living in a house, and my mom had kind of similar experiences. They bought land and then built the house. So they didn't even buy the house, they built the house. And I still had experiences at this house, and some of them still baffle me to this day. So I do believe in them, but for some reason the old pen, I've only had a couple little experiences, so I can't. It should be so haunted, but I've collected stories of other people, and I mean, if there's a haunted place, it's the old pen. You know, I think that as employees, because we are telling the stories of these men that died at the prison, and you know, potentially their victims, their stories as well, I feel like that might prevent us from being interacted with, from being haunted. There's a certain amount of respect, and it's the people who are trying to stir them up and, you know, do all that stuff that are the ones that are having the experiences.
Yeah. The question that is asked most often as you're working just at the front desk or on a tour is this place haunted? And you always have to be like, oh, I don't know. It depends on who you ask. And then inevitably someone will say, well, what do you think? And we had a coworker who, when I started, she said, oh, you know, since we're here trying to tell their stories, they kind of give us a pass. And I think that is absolutely true, that we're sort of the good guys, I guess. And not to say that anyone who comes in is a bad guy, but we're here trying to help them out and make sure their stories are heard. So I think, yeah, we get a little bit of a pass with that.
Yeah. I guess I could start off with just a story of my own, working there, I have been sitting at the front desk when there's nobody upstairs where our offices are, and I've heard footsteps. I remember that early on while working at the old pen, just like it sounds like somebody's walking from one end of the hallway to the other. And, you know, if you've worked there, if you visited, you've probably heard people upstairs. Like that's a normal sound. So to hear it when you're like, wait, I thought I was the only person here. You know, everybody's off to lunch right now. Like, what? Did you ever have that experience while you were working?
I mean, not that I can recall. I was only there really overnight, one paranormal investigation that we did. Actually, I was there twice, and one was with you, and I do have stories about that. But yeah, I think I usually try to sort of explain things away because I get so freaked out about that sort of stuff. I'm not a horror movie watcher, which is blasphemy to some people who I just don't watch them. I don't like them. And so I will usually try to like explain away something so that I don't freak myself out. So like, for example, here's like a bonus story that we hadn't planned. As most of us know, my master's degree was in Wyoming, and one of the 4 territorial prisons still standing is actually out there right in Laramie. And so as a history of Wyoming TA, I had the opportunity to take my students, and the person who was sort of your job, I think, actually, out at the Wyoming Territorial Penitentiary, she said, if you, and there was one other TA, she was like, if you guys want, I could probably fit you guys on the paranormal investigation that we're having out here. And I was just like, I mean, I do, but I also really, really, really don't. But I like felt like I had to.
I also want to sleep tonight.
Yeah, like I don't want to be so freaked out. But I went and I did it, and I remember that I was just like, I could not look up from the floor because I was afraid if I looked up that out of the corner of my eye, I would see something, like just a normal shadow of like a bird flying outside or whatever, and I'd like freak myself out. And so I was like very, just like always looking at the floor. But there was one experience, and like I will never forget this for as long as I live, because for those of you who've done paranormal investigations, I'm sure they tell you something similar. But the company that was with, my group, they said, if you feel something, whether physically or you just sort of have, that gut feeling, then say it, because it's highly likely that someone else is feeling it too. And they're not, they're afraid to voice it for whatever reason. So, we were in this room, and it was their intake room, but their intake room was really interesting because they had these stairs that went up to actually where the guards slept, because guards actually slept inside the prison. And there wasn't like a railing or anything, it was just like an open stairway. And so we were standing in this intake room, and they were doing their paranormal thing, and there was just this very distinct feeling that there was someone at the top of the stairs, like looking over all of our shoulders, like watching us. And of course I like looked back there, and there wasn't anyone there. And so after, I don't know, a couple minutes of this feeling this, I was like, oh, okay. So I said, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really feel like that there's someone standing at the top of the stairs watching us. And this girl turns to me and says, you feel that too? And I was just like, I hate this. This is not my thing. So that is the most paranormal investigation that I will ever do. But I think, I'm sure stuff like this, happens out here when our guests come for the paranormal investigations we do here. I will probably never go to one because I feel a lot more, I guess, like intimate with the spaces and the people here. So I feel like it'd be a lot more freaky if I did it. There perhaps is something to be said about these paranormal investigations.
Yeah, I think that's a common experience, that feeling of like, I'm not alone in here. And I think all of the staff, we've all had that feeling where, especially like walking up after a paranormal investigation, after 2 a.m. when, 50 guests who have been trying to reach and contact ghosts leave the site, and it's just 2 of us, one of us up at the front while the other's in the yard, closing everything down after they've stirred up all the ghosts, and you're in 5 House on the 2nd floor, shutting off circuit breakers, because that's how all the lights work up there. And it's just this feeling of dread and like, I need to get out of here. Like, I am not alone, and hair goes up, all of that feeling. I've felt that several times at the old pen. And it's like, is it in my head, or is it that thing where it's like, would another person have the same feeling, this overwhelming sense that, I'm not alone and I'm being watched right now. Right. And yeah. Yeah. That's spooky.
Well, should we maybe talk about some old Idaho penitentiary stories instead of Wyoming?
Yes, let's get to it. So, yeah, I mean, right off the bat, that admin building, we've had several staff members, both, current and past members, who have been down at the front desk and heard those footsteps, walking up on the 2nd tier. Was it a warden? Is it a guard? Don't know. Or is it just the ground, the floor popping and cracking in sequence from one end of the hallway to the next?
It's probably that.
It's probably that, yeah. going back in time, I know that there have been strange like lights, orbs, things like that filmed above, throughout the site. But like in the territorial prison, there were several suicides and deaths in there. And of course, the Rose Garden, where 6 executions occurred, there have been strange orbs and shadowy, misty-looking figures, like photos taken of these misty-looking figures. And we had, what was that, about 8-9 years ago, we had a film crew out from the news, and they went into the Rose Garden, and the news anchor got this really bad headache, and he was just like, man, it just set on me as we were out there. They snapped a photo, and there's this strange, solid figure, like orb looking thing above his head, and he said as soon as he left the Rose Garden, his headache went away. And so the investigators were like, yeah, that's a common experience. It was like it was zapping his energy so that it could produce its own observable orb, I guess you'd call it. So I've followed a lot of psychics and sensitives and mediums throughout the site, and one of the, I don't want to say the funniest, but it was a very memorable experience when this woman came out and she said, Douglas Van Vleck is up on 1890 Cell House spitting at me. And for those of you who don't know, we'll get to Douglas's story. Douglas Van Vleck committed suicide in 1890 Cell House. So that was just like, wow, that's interesting that you would know that. And he seems like he would be a spitter.
Yeah, he totally does.
So that those are just a couple of like the little things. People have definitely had eerie feelings in 1890 Cell House. And if you go in there now, all the cells were stripped out of there in the 1960s by the JCs and turned into kind of a rec room. So it's kind of a big empty shell of a building, but you can still see where the upper tiers were. There's where the central walkway was. That's still accessible. So there is this feeling of like things looking down on you from there. Yeah, but let's go to Two House, Skye.
Yeah, so
you have any stories about that?
I do. So these are this one story that I have is from the Big River Paranormal, which is the official sort of group that comes out and does the investigations. So this is from someone who did one of these investigations. So this is in Two House. It says, I was a guest on a tour before I joined the team. We were standing facing the cells when we heard a very loud but distant scream come from the very top tier of Two House on the far right side. A team member ran outside to see if anyone was there, thinking it might be an owl, but nothing was found. We quieted down again, and then after a few moments, we heard another distant scream from the upper floor. There was no discernible explanation for the sound. Just like chills. I get chills through all of these because it just like I don't know. It's because there's no explanation. I think maybe.
Right.
You hear a scream and you're outside and like, was it? Is there something nearby that's making that sound? And there's just not any sort of explanation that you can find, and it just. Ugh.
Two House is one of those very spooky cell houses. It's got that really historic feel. It was burned in the 73 riot, so there's that charring left over. And it's, it was active 1911 through 1967. It's got a long history, a lot of deaths and suicides and attempted suicides, a lot of emotions in that cell house. The conditions were horrible, so you can imagine, sitting there baking during the summer and freezing during the winter. So the depression in that cell house would have been extreme. Mm-hmm. And, we've commonly on these investigations, visitors have said they've looked up and seen a figure leaning over the edge down at them, like a shadowy figure. And we've heard that so many times. And I've been on these things and I'm too afraid to look up because if I see that, I have to come back into work the next day. I don't want to. Amber, our site administrator, and I were in there one day and we were just talking about paranormal activity and things like that. And I don't remember what it was. We got onto that subject while we were in Two House. And we heard, it sounded like somebody threw a rock. And it was just right after we were discussing it. It was just perfectly timed. And we both went, okay, all right, well, we'll stop talking about this. All right. And we left. And it was just like, yeah, that was kind of a strange thing. This last weekend, I was given a tour to this group I'm a proud member of called Treasure Valley Murderinos. And Leslie Hagerman and her sister Elisa were in there a couple years ago. And they had gotten a brand new camera. And as soon as they got into Two House, it started to act up. It was starting to act really glitchy. It was brand new. They had never had any issues with it. And this is a pretty common thing. Later, they would actually go into the cooler, and we'll get to the cooler towards the end of this show. And this fully charged brand new camera just drained suddenly, like completely. So, yeah.
Spooky.
How about Three House?
Three House, I remember there wasn't like a distinct experience, but it was my first time coming back after, or I was sort of an intern at the time. It was that summer that I wasn't an intern, but I wasn't a full-time employee either. And I was there for one of the late summer events that we do as it started to get dark. And I just remember going up on the upper tier of Three House. And again, it wasn't a specific experience, but I just remember that feeling that you get of just like, I am not alone here. This is super spooky. And I wasn't about to engage with anything that was there. But there definitely just is that feeling of and that was before I was really super engaging with the site as a historical resource, basically. And so I think there's still, to me, was sort of the eeriness to it over the history part. Because I, as the longer that I worked there, the less I started to feel that way, after it got dark and things like that. But I remember in Three House, there was just something that I just was like, ugh, it's fine.
One of the most famous ghost stories from Three House is from the head of Big River Paranormal. Her name is Marie Cuff. And several years ago, she was up on that fourth tier, up in the upper tiers that are usually closed off to the public. And there's actually a burned out cell, basically a remnant from the 1973 riot in which an inmate, he was targeted. He was going to be killed. They put flammable liquid in his cell, and they were waiting for him to come back into his cell to screw his light bulb in and catch him on fire. And fortunately for him and most of the tier, it went off when no one was in there. So he survived. But it's really scary up in that fourth tier. And 2 cells down from that cell, which is completely obliterated from that fire, there's really dark cell from all the soot and everything. But on the very back wall, there are these photos, these little pictures of people. And I've recently found out through some digging, it's actually the band Deep Purple. So it's all 5 members of the band, the original lineup from Deep Purple that one of the inmates had clipped from a newspaper and pasted to the wall. And somehow they've survived this firebombing. But Marie, she's up there and she's looking at these photos outside of the cell. And she kind of reaches her arms in with her camera. She's getting as close as she can to take a photo of these 5 guys on the back wall when something touched the top of her head, ran its fingers through her hair, and then whispered, "Ooh,
no,
pretty."
No.
In her ear.
No.
Yeah. And she did not return to that cell house, did not come back in for years because it was such an experience. So if you've watched most paranormal shows about the old pen, she is interviewed, that story is haunting. That is my favorite story. When people ask me, is this place haunted? I'm like, well, let me tell you Marie's story, because I've actually had her tell the story in person during presentations at Frightened Felons before, because it's just haunting. And the fact that she's just no, I swear this happened. And she is a great paranormal investigator. Oh my gosh. I don't think I would return to the site after that.
Same.
Oh.
Yeah, that one is.
Yeah. But otherwise, Three House, it was kind of the best cell house to live in. Just conditions wise, it had the best ventilation, it had plumbing. a lot of the guys, in oral history say Treehouse is the place to be. So I think that it has the best, other than that fourth tier, that burned out cell, which, we'll get to that story someday when we do the whole 73 riot story, because that is wild in itself. But, it doesn't give me the heebie-jeebies like some of the other cell houses.
No, I would agree. I think, other than being there at night that one time, but like I said, it was sort of early on in my career, so definitely going in there, it feels a little more solid and sturdy.
Strangely, Four House, it's one of the most modern cell houses, and we get a lot of paranormal activity in that cell house. Do you want to tell the next little story here?
Yeah. Okay, so this story is actually from, it sounds like it's from one of the lead investigators. And so they say that during an investigation with guests, another investigator and myself went out to check on the teams, only to find Four House empty. We stopped inside anyway and heard a conversation between two men on the far side of the block. We went around to that side and found no one there, but still heard the conversation, but realized it was on the second tier. We proceeded down the block when I saw a man-sized shadow go quickly through the guard's passway. We followed, and as we were turning the corner, I heard a man shouting in my right ear right in front of the first cell that we came to. I told the other investigator what had happened. We went a short distance and stopped and turned, and there was the shadow man standing next to the cells. He was about 6 feet tall, did not speak, and after a minute or so moved to the last cell and went inside. We checked that cell, and there was no one there.
There was no one there. Ugh. Ugh.
This is like when I was on that paranormal investigation, I was like, I cannot look around. Like, if I see a shadow anything, I will run out of this place screaming.
Right. And that's the funny thing. Most paranormal investigations, the whole group will see a shadow run by on these upper tiers that are closed off to the public. Like, there should be nobody up there. And the only people who have access to that are staff members. And we are like, nope, we don't want to be involved with any of this stuff. So we're going to be up at the front and just let us know if anyone gets hurt.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that they arrive at this cell that they just saw a 6 foot tall silent figure walked into. Ugh.
Well, and that there was, they turn the corner and a man shouts in his ear. No, thank you. There's a reason, again, that I don't do those paranormal investigations.
One of our volunteers, David Hobbin, he does paranormal investigations as well, and he's been part of Big River and the other iterations of that paranormal group for years. And he said during an investigation about 2 years ago, they were doing a sit-in there in Four House on the ground floor, and they heard footsteps several times in the upper floors, like somebody was walking around in the upper tiers. And if you come or have come to our Frightened Felons event, that is like where the haunted house is. It's up on the third and fourth tiers of the cell block. So there might be a spirit who's like actually haunting the haunted house up there.
Ooh.
It's the reason we say it's the only haunted cell block, haunted house in the state, because literally we've had paranormal experiences. I've been up in the haunted house, like helping set it up, and I'm always ready to get out of there. And like, I don't know if it's, the morbid corpses and things that are hanging out there to spook people, but
JC.
A shout out to JC. He's JC Brain. He's our awesome haunted house maker.
And I think Frightened Felons is coming up this weekend, right? I mean, not when this is airing, but when we're recording.
It was last weekend. Yes. Yeah. Right now we're recording 2 days before Frightened Felons, but when this comes out, it will have happened. And I hope everybody who came enjoyed it. And
hopefully y'all had fun and got spooked. By hopefully something not real, but if you did get spooked by something real, then let us know.
Yeah. Four House, it's strangely like that's where the most apparitions, where the physically seeing
that's so interesting.
A being has happened. Other than the figure up in the upper tiers of 2 House leaning over the rail. 5 House, we've had several, and I think let's go back to a historic thing. I actually toured with a former guard last July, and he just came in. He was just like, "Oh, I just wanted to tour the site." And so, of course, I'm like, "Can I follow you around?" He's like, "Sure." I'm like, "Can I record our conversation?" Go right ahead. So I nerded out and just like followed him around. He told me all kinds of crazy stories. And as we were outside of Five House, he's like, "You know what? I used to see Ray." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, when I first started here, I worked up in this guard tower behind Five House, behind maximum security. Above that little exercise yard, there's that guard tower." And he said one night he was sitting there and he saw a figure up on the second tier. And he's like, that was, they were in lockdown. That is where all the inmates, they would have been in their cells at that time. There's no reason anybody should have been walking around. So I radioed a guard, and this guard walked in and he checked it out and he said, "Yeah, there's nobody up here." And then a minute later, he said, "You must have seen Ray."
Nope.
And he's like, "Excuse me? This is in the 70s. So he's like, "Can you explain that further?" And he's like, "Yeah, there was a guy who was hung here back in 1957. That was Ray Snowden. We've had a lot of reports. You probably saw Ray."
No
And he's
way.
just like,
Oh my
he was very
gosh.
matter of fact about this story. And I was like, "Excuse me?" So he's like, "Yeah, Ray still, I imagine he probably still haunts this place. He probably still runs around here, but he's not going to hurt nobody." And it was just like, oh my gosh. Strangely, I've also had several psychics and mediums, 3 of them, at 3 different times come in and say that as you walk in the front door of maximum security, that first row of cells on the ground floor, there's the third one in. There's a cell that has like teal paint up above the door. And 3 different psychics on 3 separate occasions have come to the front desk and said, "There is a spirit in that cell. He keeps saying that he's wrongfully convicted. He should not be here, and he wants out." And the last one actually explained, she's like, "Yeah, he has his hair slicked back." And she's like, he's got his sleeves rolled up, and he's got a pack of cigarettes up in that rolled up sleeve. And he's a smooth talker. He kind of looks maybe Italian or something. And he does not belong here. And he's insisting he does not belong here. And so I actually went out there not long after that last psychic and set up my camera in front of the cell. And I was going throughout the whole site just getting B film for our little YouTube videos. So if you want to check those out, we've got videos on YouTube. I kind of tell a couple inmate stories. I was just filming and I was like, "Are there any spirits here? Can you show yourself?" And right after I said that, this little like ball of light comes dancing out of the cell and it kind of moves around and disappears. And I didn't see it while I was filming. I went up to the second floor and aimed a camera down at that cell from the second floor of maximum security, and I said the same thing. And you see this thing kind of pop out of the cell, this little ball of light kind of pop out of the cell and then return back to the cell. And I didn't see anything while I was filming. It wasn't until later when I was going through all my B-reel that I found this thing. So I actually put that video on our Old Idaho Penitentiary YouTube page, so you can go check that out. It was cold outside. There were no bugs. There was nothing in there. It was just me. Maybe it's dust, but how it moves around was just so oddly, I don't know. What would you say for that?
I would say I have chills is what I would say. But yeah, I mean, dust has a very specific way of moving, and if it moves out and then moves back, that seems less dust-like.
Right.
And so I just want to make sure I got this clear. So you set up the first camera, you said, "Are there any ghosts here?" And then you or "Are there any spirits here?" And then you left. And then you went up to the second floor and then said it again. You didn't like say it at the same time.
Yeah, no, they were separate. So it was right after I said, "Are there any spirits in here? Can you show yourself?" And right after I said that, that's when this thing kind of dances out of the cell.
And it did it twice.
Moves and weaves between the bars and then flies off. Yeah, and then I went to the second floor and said, "Are there any spirits in here?" And then right after that, I don't think I have the audio in that video, but then you see something pop out of that cell and then like do this little U-turn back into the cell. I have it in so many different ways. I was just like, oh, this is the only physical proof I've ever gotten of things here at the old pen. I've got to make a video on it. So I did that, and I have it in like black and white, and I did all kinds of different stuff so that you can really easily, clearly see it move. So check it out. Tell me what you think. Maybe it's dust. Maybe it's just I don't know. It wasn't a windy day. All the footage I got was just kind of like a nice, I think it was a spring day, like early spring, so it was pretty chilly outside, and there were no bugs. It was very spooky.
Yeah,
Then
sounds spooky.
Death Row. Yeah, in Death Row, of course, Raymond Snowden, that's where his spirit would probably reside. But there's another spirit in that area.
Is it Hippie Joe?
Hippie Joe, exactly. Yeah. So this guy, his name was Abraham Watson, and Abe, in 1971, he's in Fort Hall, the reservation, and he's drinking, and he's becoming belligerent at this bar. And so police are called, and these two sheriffs arrive, and they come in and try to, quell the situation that's starting to arise here. And they realize that Abe has a revolver. And so they're like, "Hey, sir, you need to set that thing down." And he pulls it out, and they wrestle over it, and it actually fires and strikes one of the officers in the head. It ricochets off of his skull, though, and just gives him a concussion. Abe is arrested. He's convicted, 2 years sentenced to the prison for assault with intent to commit murder. And when he arrives, they realize that this guy, he's not mentally stable. There's something going on with him. And so they sent him to State Hospital South out in Blackfoot. And he actually escapes. And after 2 months, actually turns himself back into this state hospital. And not long after returning, he gets into an argument with a deaf inmate there. And he ends up nearly choking this guy to death before he's broken up. And they realize, this guy, he needs professional guards. He needs protection. And so they have to send him back to this penitentiary. And they use Death Row to segregate him away from the rest of the population. And they get him back on meds. They give him Thorazine. They kind of calm him down. And he seems to be, coming back into terms. He's still hearing things. The guards said that he was speaking to God and seemed to be in higher spirits. And they kind of let him be until one day they come in and he had hung himself in one of the cells in Death Row. He had done it. He had used his overalls, and using the grates in the very back of the cells at the top, they're at probably about 9 feet or so. He had wrapped his overalls into those grates, and standing up on his sink, he must have taken a deep breath, because when they cut him down from this really long this escaped from his body. And the guards, like, we had a guard who came out about 6 years ago, just before I started working at the old pen, but he still very vividly remembered cutting Abraham Watson from his little noose and having this moan come out. And we've had volunteers and tour guides and visitors who have been in Death Row who have heard this low growl, this low groan emitting from one of these cells. And in a lot of oral histories, they actually describe him as Hippie Joe, I think just because he was having psychological issues and all these different things. It was 1971 when all this stuff went down. Yeah, if you've ever been in Death Row and you've heard a low guttural growl, you're probably hearing Abe.
Oh, man. I'm really glad that I have never heard that sound, because, again, that's one of those things that I'd probably just, walk in and be like, so I'm leaving. I'll see you guys,
Right.
See you guys never.
Yeah, me too. One thing I always, I know it's going to happen someday, but there was a former inmate who used to feed Raymond Snowden. He was in here in 57 and 63 and 67 and 71. He was in and out of here. But when he was in 57 for a robbery, he was put on as a trustee, and one of his jobs was to bring food to each inmate over in maximum security. And so he fed Ray every single day for the 11 months that Ray was in that cell house. And with every meal, he said that Ray would eat a raw onion like an apple. So I'm always worried that I'm going to walk in there and have one of those overwhelming senses of smelling onions while I'm in death row. So if anyone has ever had that experience, let us know. Well, should we go to some of the outer buildings?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so how about the laundry? If anyone's been to the old pen and you've gone into that laundry and seen all of that equipment, seen that spooky machine called the Mangler, you maybe have had some weird feelings in there. And we've had a lot of reported experiences of strange noises, seeing lights, like strange lights dancing around near the ceiling. Big River Paranormal recorded this report. They wrote, I had a group of guests, and we were doing an EVP session right at the center part of the room in the laundry. And while I was facing the door next to the showers, I saw a man walk to the window area, look out, and retreat back into the room. This was witnessed by at least one of the guests. So that means, like, they saw a figure facing the door next to the showers, like, look in at them and then walk out of the room. If you've watched, like, Ghost Adventures, they talk about this is a myth that somebody was raped to death in the showers, and there are no reports of this ever happening at the old pen. But there were a number of deaths in that shirt factory building, which the laundry is a part of. I don't know. Did you ever have any experiences in the laundry? Have you ever heard anything?
I've never. Again, this is sort of one of those things that I've never had any specific experience, but there, and like it's sort of with Three House where I first had that experience and I was like, oh, it's so spooky in here, and then I just sort of got over it. But like the laundry, every time I had to open the site or close the site, I hate the laundry. It could be middle of summer, it's still lit up super bright, and I'm just like, I hate this. There's something about it, and I don't know what it is. It is just super spooky. And I remember the first time locking up a paranormal investigation with you. You just looked in and you were just like, this. It's just so cavernous and dark. And I just was like, I need you to stop talking. Like, I'm freaking out right now. But yeah, I mean, that is just one of those. There's a couple buildings on site that every time I go in, I'm just like, oh, I hate being in here. And that is one of them. And it's unexplainable. But it's just sort of one of those. Because, I mean, from the, it's just a laundry room, and there are those big machines, and one of them is called the Mangler, and inevitably someone got an arm or a hand or something caught in it, but it just, the whole feeling of that whole space is just almost too much for me.
There's something about just that whole shirt factory building, because I've spent so much time in there for, setting up for events and all that different stuff, and I've heard so many raps, and I've been around so many historic objects in there that I definitely get a feeling when I'm in there by myself that I'm going to turn a corner and see something. And I haven't yet, but there's always that like, man, I hope that doesn't have that, just that pit of the stomach feeling like, I hope I don't run into anything right now.
Right, totally.
Recently, just this spring, there was a group filming a feature film, a horror film that's going to come out hopefully in early 2020 called Paranormal Prison. And it's a pretty interesting, it's a fun story. Definitely go watch it when it comes out. But while they were filming, they had a bunch of strange technical difficulties. They were using GoPros for a lot of the filming, and it's a lot of like live action, found footage sort of look to it. And their GoPros kept having issues. And GoPros, you should be able to drop that out of an airplane and still be able to watch the video. If you ever watched that, there's a great GoPro video. It's my favorite video on the internet. And it's this GoPro falling out of a plane, and it lands in a pig pen. And you see the pigs like come over and start sniffing it. It's the funniest video in the world. So if you're having a bad day, go watch that video. Anyway, they were having issues with their GoPros. And that was just one of the things. So here's actually a write-up from one of their members here. This is Eugene Boyle wrote this. I was hired as a gaffer and grip. Although lighting requirements were minimal given the nature of the filming, I still had the challenge of getting power to various locations in and around the nearly 150-year-old penitentiary. Although it is currently a tourist attraction run by the Idaho State Historical Society, it still uses much of the same wiring and breakers it had back in the 60s and 70s, which is true. We have that problem very regularly. On day one of principal photography and throughout the shoot, camera and wireless mic batteries would die inexplicably, sometimes within minutes of being fully charged. Then, although monitors showed clear continuous signal while filming, post-production editing proved to be tricky because of dropped and glitchy video signal on the memory cards. This was tough to explain, but it was not, by far, the strangest thing that occurred on set. At the start of day 2, a few minutes after call time and while everyone was scattered getting set up for the first scene of the day, I found myself in the old shirt factory room that was used as a base camp. Also in the room was our associate producer, first AD, and one of the camera assistants. I have worked with all of these individuals in the past and knew them all to be focused, hardworking professionals. So it was curious to me when I looked across the room and witnessed the camera assistant spinning around with one hand in the air as if performing pirouettes. After 2 or 3 revolutions, the camera assistant fell to one knee, crumpled over in the fetal position, and started shaking violently. Our first AD was an Army medic in a previous career and jumped into action, directing me to help turn the camera assistant on their side and get something soft under their head. He had me grab the first aid kit and quickly found something to keep them from biting their tongue. In the meantime, the camera assistant was shaking violently and was instantly covered in sweat. After 2 or 3 minutes, the camera assistant fell asleep. I would have been terrified if I had not heard actual snoring as if in deep sleep. 2 minutes later, the camera assistant was awake and struggling to stand up. The first AD and I did our best to reassure the camera assistant that everything was fine, but that they needed to stay down until the ambulance arrived. Suddenly, the struggling stopped. The camera assistant reached up, grabbed me by the lapels, and whispered in a soft but terrified voice, "The little boys are going to die."
No, what?
It was unnerving. The camera assistant's eyes were opened wide and teeth were grit tight in a tense grimace. I did my best to remain calm and to reassure myself it must be some sort of dream state when the whisper came again more insistently. "The little boys are going to die." I did my best to stay calm and focused. The paramedics arrived minutes later, and by that time the camera assistant had started coming back to reality, dazed, confused, and insisting that we were the ones that had a seizure. Our producer accompanied the camera assistant to the hospital, and the parents were notified of the seizure. They were shocked and informed us that the camera assistant had never had a seizure before, and the next day all hospital tests came back negative. No signs of any medical issues or of the previous day's episode.
This is clearly the start of a horror movie.
Right?
Come on.
It's so scary. I've tried to, try to think of all the 129 deaths at the institution. I don't think any of them were in for killing little boys. The only thing I could think of is maybe Earl Bowen, but he was convicted of murdering an elderly woman, and he had a tragic death, and that was in the old prison hospital. So I'm not sure.
Well, but I wonder. Well, because sometimes though ghosts, spirits, whatever it is we want to call them, sometimes they don't necessarily haunt where they died. They haunt sort of wherever they were most comfortable.
Yeah.
Is what I've heard. And so if he and I would hate to say this, but maybe he had a decent time, or he doesn't, he doesn't know where else to go, and he had this place that he is fine kind of sticking around. I don't know. That's such a weird, oh my God.
It's one of my new favorite stories for sure. Favorite paranormal stories there. It's
That's so wild.
Yeah. I have not experienced that, or if I have, no one witnessed it, which is scary.
That's, I think, even scarier.
Right.
That's legit. That is legit a horror movie.
That is.
And you were living it.
I don't want to go to work tomorrow. No, I do. I love it.
Sorry, Amber, I quit. Good luck. I'll see you never.
Yes, yeah. Now, if anyone listens to this podcast, they're not going to work there anymore. They're not going to want to come volunteer anymore. Anyway.
You won't get possessed.
Yeah.
Anthony's worked there for 5 years now, and he's still the happiest, go luckiest guy. He hardly even believes in ghosts. So
It's true. Yeah, I feel like I've had less paranormal experiences since I've worked at the old pen. It's just been a couple strange things, but nothing like that. Oh my gosh! Wow. Bill Butler, during the 1971 riot, was brutally bludgeoned and stabbed to death in that building. So, and Bill Butler, he had a lot of mental issues, and he had a 75-year sentence for murdering a college co-ed and dumping her body in the desert. There was another inmate who actually dove from the top of the shirt factory building face first into the pavement below. That was a suicide from the shirt factory building. So, I haven't really dug into that inmate's story very much beyond finding that suicide. So maybe I'll do some looking and see if there's any connection there. Ugh.
I'm not a fan of that. I mean, like, it's interesting. I'm not a fan of that.
Yeah. Well, why don't we go next door to the barber shop and tell our story? Remember that?
Oh, of course I remember it. It was really the first paranormal experience that I had out there, and it was right before you looked in the deep dark cavern of the laundry room, and you're like, isn't it so creepy? And I was just like, stop talking.
Verbatim, stop talking. I don't want to hear this. Like, I'm ready to get out of here, go home, and not think about ghosts.
And then I found a spot where there was light, and I was recording Instagram videos like, you guys, I hate everything about this. I never volunteered for another paranormal investigation again, you'll have noticed.
Yeah.
So it was, I had never locked up before, I don't think. And I'm already pretty on edge because I do sort of believe in ghosts, and I had that experience in Wyoming, and I was just like, oh, it's fine. And so you were like, well, come on, I'll show you how to lock up. And so you were showing me how to lock up, and we get to the barber shop, and you were telling this story about, who is it again?
Jewel Frang.
And so he walks up to the barber shop, and he grabs the razor out of the barber's hand and slits his own throat, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so you're telling me the story as you're sort of just like, haha, isn't it funny that I'm talking about this? And just like that experience that you had with Amber, it sounded like someone picked up a rock and threw it in the back corner of the building.
Yeah.
And both you and I immediately just stopped talking.
What the heck was that?
And then I was like, lock this building up, we're leaving. I'm so sorry. Good night, boys. We're leaving you alone now.
Oh.
And I mean, because that is the thing is we really try not to bother these guys, and they, I think, try not to bother us. But when we're going through locking up and they've been riled up for the last several hours, it's hard not to have those experiences. So yeah, I definitely remember that quite vividly, just hearing that sound and just both of us just freezing.
Yeah. That was spooky.
Okay, good night. I was so mad at you that night because you just kept saying sort of these spooky things, and I was like, please stop. We've already had an experience.
Well, that's the thing is especially when I'm giving tours, and then I get that one person who's like, I want to know all the paranormal stories. And so then I'm like, I've got them. They're all stuck in my head, and I need to share them. I just start telling them, and then I start to see the group just kind of people start to walk away, and then people are looking sad. I'm like, you know what? I need to stop on these stories. This is really depressing. And I was doing that night. I wanted to kind of tell you some of the spooky stories of, maybe they had experiences out here. And I started to realize, whoa, maybe I shouldn't be telling this right now. Yeah.
You can tell me them in the daylight.
Yes.
They're just as spooky in the daylight.
These are the daylight story tours. Do what you want at night, but I am not going to be here telling these stories then. Yeah.
Seriously.
So back around the barbershop and the old prison hospital, there are the solitary confinement cells and the group confinement cells, Siberia and the cooler. And Siberia, we have several stories of people saying they've, felt dread, they've reached their hand in and felt something electric, or they've actually had something pull on their hand, reaching their hands into those cells. So next time you're at the old pen, I recommend it. Reach your arm into one of those cells. It's a tiny little wicky door. It's about a foot tall. You just reach your arm into this dark cell and see what happens and report back. Let us know. But around the cooler, we have several strange experiences that people have had. One, I was in there with this radio show, and they had hired a psychic to kind of lead through and see if they had any experiences. And he walked into that first cell in the cooler to the left as you walk in, the one that we did the episode about Robert Miller Early, where he etched his number and where Mike Donnelly etched it to the side there. And he stepped into that cell and he said, something is trying to possess me right now.
No, sir.
And I said, excuse me? He's like, yes, something is trying to possess me. Should I let it? And
should I let it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So I literally, I walked out of the building. I kind of stuck my head in. I was like, yeah, go right ahead. And he said, it's got evil intentions. And so I'm not going to let it. And I was like, yeah, of course it does. Like, if it's trying to possess. Yeah. So we've had a lot of strange phenomena, especially in that first cell to the left. We've had a lot of people have experiences there. One fella actually, local news was out and they were filming, and I think he was in that cell, and he's got a shaved head, and he said something touched the top of his head while he was in that cell, and he started looking around and he said there was nothing in there, and it was really freaked him out. And we have a couple stories from Big River Paranormal. Let me read them to you here. Another investigator and I were going inside, and I thought I saw a guest standing in the corner to my left as I entered the building. I excused myself and stepped away. Another investigator was right behind me and did the same thing. When we looked, there was no one in the corner, even though the building had a group of guests inside. No one had seen anyone else in the corner. So, like, there was a figure standing there right to the left, right in that cell area. Here's another one. Another time I had a group of guests, and there was a pair of ladies who had a K2 meter and were attempting to make contact with no results. Remembering my other encounter, I told them to focus on that area of the room and the first cell on the left as you walk in. I started asking questions, and we received multiple answers to direct questions. So these K2 meters, basically it's a little light, and if there's any sort of electronic phenomenon, it'll pick up this light. And usually, especially at the old pen, there's very little electricity throughout the site, and there's zero electricity in that corner where Siberia and the cooler is, so nothing should register over there. But when they were asking questions, it started to light up. And then after a few questions, we found out he has a thing for ladies in general, and he liked her friend more than her. So it seemed to be kind of a creeper ghost in the cooler there.
Yeah. Yikes.
Pretty common situation there,
You
though.
should figure out you should see if you can figure out who was in that, like what he did. Do you think it's all the same spirit that evil wants to possess that guy, that has the thing for ladies? Do you think they're the same?
Most likely, yeah, probably. That's the thing is, though, I've never come across any deaths in the cooler. There's one in Siberia. This individual hung himself from that little wicky door that's just about 3 feet off the floor. But other than him, I don't...
Which, it's a wild story.
Yeah.
But again, it could just be that thing of... or who's to say that he died in the cooler? Who's to say he didn't die elsewhere on the site?
Exactly.
And whatever reason got stuck there or wanted to spend time there.
Yeah. Or,
Gross.
when you're in those cells, like, your sense of reality, it gets completely obliterated. So maybe that was the last place where he was himself. And, where, kind of his spirit left him before he committed suicide or did any number of things. I know Earl Bowen, as I spoke about earlier, he, just around the corner from there, was in the prison hospital after spending a year and a half in Siberia, and he probably would have been moved between Siberia and the cooler, and he was being given like antipsychotics, Thorazine, and things like that after he had cut himself multiple times. And there are oral histories where they had to stitch him up so many times because he kept cutting himself while he was locked in these solitary confinement cells. And he got released and put into the prison hospital, And while he was in there, he actually leapt from his bed and he took a bottle of pine oil and drank half of it before the attendants caught him and stopped him from finishing it.
Yes.
They ended up pumping his stomach, and because he was such an issue, they actually had to strap him to the bed. And so he had
this is the worst story.
one of the worst deaths. He actually started vomiting while in this bed, strapped to this bed, and he started to choke on his vomit. And he actually started wriggling the bed until it fell over, and it landed on his leg. It broke his leg, and he choked to death on his own vomit. And maybe it could be him. He was not a good man. He brutally murdered this elderly woman in this boarding house that kind of put him up. He went out kind of the way he came in, just a issued individual, both mentally, physically. He was constantly getting into fights. He stabbed another inmate to death. Yeah, so maybe, now the more that I think about it, maybe it is Earl that's still in there. He did spend like the longest amount of time in those solitary cells. So
I just know that I'm not sleeping tonight.
Scott. That's
that whole it has evil intentions. I'm just like, nope,
right.
No, thank you.
Yeah. And
Oh, boy.
so I mean, we've gone through pretty much every building at the old pen that has had some sort of experience, some sort of situation.
Well, there's one experience that I had actually just around the corner from the cooler in Siberia.
Yes.
And this one is sort of like iffy, where it's just like, was it just my imagination? But it felt very real at the time. And it was when we were doing a Sleepless in Stripes event. It was the very last one that I did before. I think it was like the week before I left.
And for listeners, that's an overnight event. You get to spend the night at the old pen.
Yeah. And so it was our second one, and we were still sort of refining the activities. And so this particular activity, it was a behind the scenes sort of tour and like a contraband finding sort of, activity. And they could just, come in and we had opened one of the Siberia cells, which are normally not open, other than those wiki doors and that very first one. But we had opened, we had taken the door off the lock so you could close it all the way and sort of feel what that would feel like. And so I was stationed in there, and Siberia was always, that first few years that I was there, was always one of those buildings that I hated to be in.
Yeah.
I would walk in on this tour and just be like, I hate the feeling of this building. It just is so creepy, and it's such a unsympathetic building, because these men were put in these cells for 24 hours a day. It is completely dark even on the brightest day. It is just not a place you would want to be, and it's continually not a place that like any of us would want to be. So at this point, it's starting to get dark. Not a lot of people are making their way into the building, because I was there to sort of answer any questions anyone had, and so it was kind of getting toward the end of when that time was over. And I remember I was leaning against the cell, so my back was to the cells facing the door. And every once in a while, from the road, which is pretty far away, but if you get a really loud car or whatever, it'll echo off the wall. But it didn't sound like that. It when your ears, like when you've been at a really loud event and then for the first time you're somewhere quiet and you hear that like the sound just sort of grows in your ringing ears. That feeling.
Uh-huh.
So I was leaning against the cells, and it just sounded like a roar of voices coming from the cells that started quiet and then sort of got louder. And I remember I was maybe doing something I was not supposed to be doing, like texting. And I remember I was texting, and I looked up from my phone and like looked around. That was how different of a sound it was. And I just remember having that distinct feeling of like, it just sounded like all these voices from behind me of all these men who'd been kept in these cells that were just sort of coming together all at once. And it was weird. It was freaky. And I just remember thinking like, maybe it was sort of a car that was really loud and it had echoed off the wall, but it was such a weird way that the sound had had come and gone. That I just was like, I don't know if it, but I tried to explain it away the best I could, but I was like, at that point, like looking at my watch, like, can I leave yet? Can I lock this stupid thing up? And I want to go. But it was really strange.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I remember filming you. You, like, as we were locking up, you came down to the dungeon and you're like, Anthony, I just had a weird experience down in Siberia. So I was like, okay, I've got my camera ready. Let's go. and we filmed you like telling that same story. And you seemed kind of like a little bit freaked out. I was like, whoa. Yeah.
It was like, it's definitely an experience. Like when you're alone, like when I was with you, I was like, well, at least I'm with Anthony. Like nothing can happen. But when it's you, it's just you. And you have to sort of be like, is this just my brain? Or is this something that actually happened? And it does sort of mess with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it was, I probably will never forget either of those two experiences for like as long as I live.
That's amazing. I love that. Oh my gosh. Are there any other stories in the yard that you can think of?
Not in the yard that I can think of. There's the one out in the women's ward.
Yes.
That is probably my favorite. It didn't happen to me, thankfully, but when I heard about it, it like blew my mind. And so I would love to hear like Amber's actual take on it, but you know, the basics of it is, you know, Amber was out in the women's ward. And actually after hearing that she did this, I always did my best. Like anytime I opened or anytime I closed, I would say like hello to the ladies.
Oh.
So I'd be like, good morning, ladies, or like, good night, have a good night, ladies. Like just, I'm here, I'm doing your work. Like I'm here to be your friend. Like, please don't bother me. But she was, you know, out locking the women's ward, and when you go in, every once in a while you'll have sort of stragglers who got kicked out of the pen early because we were locking up, so they'll head out to the women's ward. But she made sure, you know, she said, okay, I'm locking up, is anyone in here? And she said no one answered. And she said that she turned around to sort of, you know, walk out the building, and she said there was just a puff of smoke in her face, like someone had taken a drag off a cigarette and just blown it straight in her face. And she said that she looked around and again said, is there anyone in here? And there was no answer. There was no one in any of the rooms. And that I cannot even, like, I don't even know what I would do.
Right.
If I was her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, my experience was enough that I was like, Anthony, let's record this. I kind of freaked out. But to have that, like, I mean, that's distinct. That is wild. I would be so interested to know if it was a lady, you know, one of our ladies, you know, we didn't have any women die, or, you know, if it is one of the ladies, like, who is it and who decided to come back to that place? If it isn't one of our ladies, then who is it? You know, that's the real question. But I think it would make sense that it would be cigarette smoke. You know, they smoked freely out here. The entire history of the prison, both men and women. So it completely makes sense to me that would be what manifests in the women's ward, but I just want to know who it was.
Definitely. I forgot to tell, I had a story. It wasn't long after Amber's, actually. And
in the women's ward?
It was in back in Four House again.
Oh.
And I was locking up. It was 5 o'clock. And I took an Instagram of it right after, but I always go through and I yell, locking up into each cell house, make sure I'm not locking anybody in. And I heard somebody, it sounded like they were walking down the corridor at Four House with their hands running along the bars. And so I was like, maybe they didn't hear me because it sounded like they were just kind of puttering along. So I was like, locking up. And I kept hearing it, so I walked down to the end of the hall and around the back side of the tiers, and there was nobody there.
Mm-mm.
My hair went up, and I, like, left, and I was the only person still in the yard, and it was like, okay, it was like they were teasing me. And,
right.
I don't know. Yeah. And I took an Instagram. I was like, okay, I just had the weirdest experience. I was just locking the cell house, and I heard somebody walking down here. And yeah, because I remember it happened like 2 or 3 weeks after Amber's experience, and just being like, oh no, are we all going to start having paranormal experiences from now on? And
oh my gosh.
yeah.
I mean, so what do you think, Anthony? Is the old Idaho Penitentiary haunted?
Yes, I think. I hate saying that because we look at it as historians as this historical object, and add people who all had very distinct stories. It's hard to paranormal experiences. There are so many, and we continue to get them. I have to say that if you believe in that sort of thing, you'll probably have some sort of experience.
Right.
That is unexplainable.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to want to say that it is, because you want people to appreciate it for its historical value.
Exactly.
That's always why I was like, oh, it just depends. I've never had an experience, even though I had. And it just is because, like, that's not what this site is here for.
Right.
This site is here to let people know about Idaho history and about the history of the men and women who served there.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to focus on. And so, but the fact, I think, is that I think it is a little bit. And that is the nature of a site like ours. So, I mean, I guess I don't want to say haunted. I think maybe that the spirits maybe still reside here is maybe a nicer way of putting it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because haunted makes it seem like it's this big spooky place. But, if Ray's hanging out, he doesn't seem like he's hurting anyone. Hippie Joe might still be hanging out. He doesn't seem to be hurting anyone. There might be some that are quite malevolent, but there also might be some that just don't know where else to go.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think it is too. I think we both have had personal experiences, and I think the paranormal investigations tend to get a bit of activity every time they come out, but I think, we just have to strike that balance of appreciating the site for its historical value and still understanding that there is a little bit of this paranormal stuff that everyone wants to hear about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So what I always tell people is that, like, if you believe in that sort of thing, there have been a lot of experiences, but I think that if you hear the factual stories, I think that is scarier. Like the reality of some of the experiences for some of the men and women that were incarcerated here, that is scarier than, a paranormal entity. Like, come for the history. That might scare you more than if you come to try to be touched or poked or scratched or prodded or whatever it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you heard Earl Bowen's story. That is probably one of the darkest stories that I've ever heard. And I religiously listen to murder podcasts.
Right. Yeah.
It's rough. So come for the history, stay for the history, and if you get a little bit of extra, then good on ya.
Yeah, I like that. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Happy Halloween, everyone, and we can't wait for you to hear our second season. We are quite excited about the stories that we tell, and bear with us through some technical difficulties at the halfway through the season or so as we work our way through trying to figure out remote podcast setup, but we're working on it. We hear your feedback, and we can't wait for you guys to hear what we've got coming for you.
Yes, we appreciate all of you listeners, and thanks for listening to our Halloween special here. Seriously, if you're listening to this and you've had an experience, let us know. I really like collecting these stories. I like to give presentations on the paranormal aspects during our October events, Frightened Felons and Dying to Get In and things like that. So I would love to include your stories in my next presentation and maybe next year's Halloween special here at Behind Gray Walls. So thank you all, and continue listening. Our new season comes out. Do your own time.
Do your own number.
We'll talk to y'all soon.
Happy Halloween. Spooky Halloween.
Please like and follow our Facebook page, Old Idaho Penitentiary. From there, you can connect with us directly by joining the Behind Gray Walls podcast group, where you can find the mugshots of the inmates featured in today's episode, supplementary images of the penitentiary, and discussions between group members. We'd love to see you there.